Red tail over Tuscany. The September sky over Tuscany burned with the last light of day when Lieutenant Marcus Williams felt his P-51 Mustang shudder beneath him. Black smoke poured from the engine cowling, and the acrid smell of burning oil filled the cramped cockpit. Below, the rolling hills stretched endlessly, dotted with vineyards that looked deceptively peaceful in the golden hour. The red tail of his aircraft, the proud marking of the 332nd Fighter Group, caught the dying sunlight as he fought to keep the plane airborne. "Come on, Redbird," he whispered through gritted teeth, using the nickname he'd given his fighter. "Just a little further. Your support means the world to us. Hit the subscribe button and join our community of romance lovers." But the engine coughed once more and fell silent. The propeller windmilled uselessly as gravity took hold. Marcus had perhaps 2 minutes to find somewhere to put down before his $25,000 fighter became $25,000 worth of scrap metal scattered across Italian soil. The vineyard rushed up to meet him. He pulled back on the stick, trying to bleed off speed as the landing gear tore through grapevines heavy with fruit. The impact threw him forward against his harness, and his head struck the instrument panel. Stars exploded behind his eyes as the Mustang carved a long furrow through the earth before coming to rest against a stone wall that had probably stood since Roman times. Consciousness came and went in waves. Through the haze, Marcus heard voices speaking rapid Italian, boots crunching on gravel, and the distant rumble of engines. German engines. His training kicked in despite the fog in his head. Evade, escape, survive. He fumbled with his harness, blood trickling down his forehead, when the canopy suddenly slid back. A woman stood silhouetted against the darkening sky. She wore a simple brown dress and a headscarf, but there was nothing simple about the way she moved. Quick, decisive, dangerous. Her dark eyes assessed him with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned to make life or death decisions in seconds. "Americano?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded, wincing at the movement. "Lieutenant Williams, United States Army Air—" "No names," she cut him off. "Can you walk?" The sound of the approaching patrol grew louder. Through the gathering dusk, Marcus could see the yellow beams of flashlights cutting through the vineyard rows. The woman, she couldn't have been more than 25, grabbed his arm and hauled him from the cockpit with surprising strength. "My leg," he gasped, stumbling as his left knee buckled. Without hesitation, she ducked under his arm and half-carried him toward a weathered stone building at the edge of the vineyard. Each step sent fire through his injured leg, but he bit back any sound that might give them away. Behind them, he could hear German voices growing closer, their harsh consonants cutting through the evening air. The barn door creaked as she pushed it open. The interior smelled of hay and olive oil with the sweet undertone of fermenting grapes. She guided him to a pile of straw in the corner and pressed a finger to her lips. Then she was gone, slipping back into the night like a shadow. Marcus lay in the darkness, listening to his own labored breathing and the approaching voices. Through a crack in the wooden wall, he could see flashlight beams dancing across the vineyard. The Germans had found his plane. "Here is der Flieger!" The shout made his blood run cold. Here is the flyer. They knew he was alive, somewhere in the area. Footsteps approached the barn. Marcus held his breath, his hand instinctively reaching for the .45 pistol at his hip. The door creaked open, and a beam of light swept across the interior. It passed over his hiding spot once, twice, then moved on. He heard muffled conversation, then retreating footsteps. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, the barn door opened again, and the woman slipped inside. She carried a small oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the walls. "They're gone," she said in accented English, setting the lamp on a wooden crate. For now. In the lamplight, Marcus could see her more clearly. She had the olive complexion common to this region, with dark hair that escaped from her headscarf in rebellious curls. There was something in her face that spoke of losses endured, of a hardness earned through suffering. But when she looked at him, he saw something else, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even concern. "You're hurt," she observed, kneeling beside him to examine his leg. "It's nothing," he lied, though the pain suggested otherwise. Her hands were gentle but efficient as she probed the injury. "The bone is not broken, But you won't be walking far tonight. She sat back on her heels, studying him. What is your name? I thought you said no names. A ghost of a smile crossed her lips. That was when the Germans were close enough to hear. She paused. I am Lucia. Marcus. He tried to sit up straighter, wincing. I need to get back to my unit. They'll be looking for me. The Germans will be looking harder. Lucia stood and moved to a wooden chest in the corner. You cannot travel in that uniform, and certainly not with that. She gestured at his pilot's wings. She produced a set of worn civilian clothes, rough pants and a faded shirt that had probably belonged to her father or brother. While Marcus changed, struggling with his injured leg, Lucia prepared a small meal of bread, cheese and wine. You are one of the colored pilots, she said, not looking at him. It wasn't a question. Marcus stiffened. Even here, thousands of miles from home, his skin color preceded him. That's right. Does that bother you? Lucia turned to face him, her expression unreadable. My little brother Giuseppe used to collect pictures of airplanes from American magazines. He had one of your red-tailed planes on his wall, said he wanted to be a pilot when he grew up. Her voice grew quiet. The Germans shot him 6 months ago. He was 14. The weight of her words settled between them. Marcus understood now, the hardness in her face, the way she moved through the darkness with such purpose. This wasn't just about helping a downed pilot. This was personal. I'm sorry, he said, meaning it. She nodded once, then handed him the simple meal. Eat. Tomorrow we move. Where? North. There are others like me, Partigiani. We fight the Germans, help Allied soldiers reach the lines. She paused, watching him. If you want to go home, you do as I say. Understood? Marcus took a bite of the rough bread, washing it down with the sharp local wine. Outside, an owl called into the night, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the faint rumble of artillery. The front lines weren't far, but they might as well have been on the other side of the world. Understood, he said. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of constant movement and hidden dangers. Lucia proved to be a master of the underground network that snaked through occupied Italy. She knew which farmers could be trusted, which roads the Germans patrolled, and how to disappear into the landscape when enemy aircraft passed overhead. They traveled mostly at night, sleeping in haylofts, abandoned buildings, and sometimes under the stars when no shelter could be found. Marcus's leg healed slowly, but Lucia set a pace that left little room for weakness. She seemed tireless, driven by a fury that burned quiet and steady. During their third night together, as they sheltered in the ruins of an ancient monastery, Marcus finally asked about her family. My father grew grapes, she said, staring into their small fire. The best Chianti in the region, he claimed. My mother sang while she cooked. Giuseppe collected his airplane pictures. She poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. The Germans came in spring. They said someone in the village was helping the resistance. They lined up all the men and boys over 12. She didn't finish the story. She didn't need to. And you? Marcus asked gently. I was in Florence, studying at the university, literature. She laughed bitterly. I wanted to be a teacher. When I came home, she shrugged. Some things change you. You can't go back to who you were before. Marcus understood that feeling. He'd grown up in Alabama, where his color had meant certain doors would always be closed to him. The Army Air Corps had been his way out, his chance to prove himself in the sky, where the only thing that mattered was how well you could fly and fight. But even there he'd faced the whispers, the doubts, the assumption that he somehow wasn't as good as his white counterparts. The 332nd has never lost a bomber we were escorting, he said quietly. Not one. But some people still think we don't belong up there. Lucia looked at him across the fire. And yet you still fight for them. I fight for the idea of what we could be, what we should be. He shifted, his leg still aching. Your brother collecting those pictures? Maybe that's what it's about. Kids who see the plane, not the pilot. The future, not the past. Something changed in Lucia's expression, a softening around her eyes. He would have liked you, she said. As they traveled north toward the Allied lines, they encountered other partisans. The network was larger and more organized than Marcus had realized, with cells operating throughout German-occupied Italy. But it was also fractured, sometimes by politics, sometimes by personal feuds that ran deeper than the war itself. It was near the town of Pontremoli that they met Enzo. He commanded a group of communist partisans who viewed the war through a different lens than Lucia's more informal band of patriots. Where Lucia fought for her murdered family and occupied homeland, Enzo saw an opportunity to reshape Italy entirely. His men were better armed, better organized, and distinctly suspicious of both Americans and the monarchist partisans who still pledged loyalty to the King of Italy. An American pilot could be valuable, Enzo mused, eyeing Marcus like a piece of merchandise. They sat in the abandoned farmhouse while rain drummed on the roof. The Germans would pay well for information about Allied air operations. "He's under my protection," Lucia said firmly. Enzo smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "How your protection? You're one woman with an old rifle. I have 30 men with German weapons we took from their dead soldiers." The tension in the room was palpable. Marcus saw hands drift toward weapons, saw the calculation in Enzo's eyes. This could go bad very quickly. "What do you want?" Marcus asked. "Information. Your base locations, patrol schedules, bombing targets." Enzo leaned forward. "The Germans aren't the only ones who need to know where the Americans will strike next. I can't give you that." "Can't or won't," Enzo's voice hardened. "Perhaps you need time to reconsider." That night, as they were given blankets in a corner of the farmhouse, Lucia whispered urgently to Marcus. "We leave before dawn. Enzo means to trade you to the highest bidder, German or otherwise." But Enzo had anticipated this. Guards were posted, and their weapons had been confiscated. As the hours passed, Marcus realized they were no longer guests, they were prisoners. It was Lucia who found the way out. During the darkest hour before dawn, she used a hairpin to work at the ropes binding their hands. Her fingers moved with practiced skill. This wasn't the first time she'd needed to escape captivity. "The window," she breathed. "My contact in the village, Maria. She has a radio." They slipped through the narrow window and into the pre-dawn mist that clung to the valley. Behind them, the farmhouse remained quiet, but Marcus knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. When their absence was discovered, Enzo would come after them with all 30 of his men. The village of Pontremoli clung to the hillside like a collection of weathered stones. Most of the windows were shuttered, and the streets lay empty in the grey light. But Lucia moved with purpose, leading him through narrow alleys to a house that looked no different from any other. Maria turned out to be a woman in her 60s, with steel-grey hair and eyes that had seen too much. She welcomed them without question, leading them to a hidden room behind her kitchen, where a radio set occupied a wooden table. "I need to contact Allied forces," Marcus explained. "There's information they need to know." As Maria worked the radio dials, trying to establish contact, Lucia stood watch at the window. The morning light was growing stronger, and soon the village would wake. If Enzo's men were searching for them, they wouldn't remain hidden for long. "There," Maria said suddenly. "I have them." The voice that crackled through the static was American, probably from a signals unit somewhere near the front lines. Marcus quickly identified himself and passed along his position, but then the operator gave him news that chilled his blood. "Lieutenant Williams, we've been trying to reach all partisan groups in your area. Intelligence indicates the Germans are planning to destroy the bridge at Pontremoli tomorrow night. Allied forces are scheduled to cross that bridge in 48 hours as part of a major offensive." Marcus felt the pieces clicking together in his mind. "What about the partisan groups? Have they been warned?" "Negative. Radio communications have been compromised in that sector. You may be our only contact." After signing off, Marcus turned to find Lucia staring at him with growing alarm. "The bridge," she said. "If the Germans destroy it, the offensive fails. Hundreds, maybe thousands of men die trying to force a crossing elsewhere." Marcus ran a hand through his hair. "We have to warn the other partisan groups. They need to protect that bridge." But as they prepared to leave Maria's house, the old woman grabbed Lucia's arm. "Be careful who you trust," she whispered. "There are rumors. Someone has been feeding information to the Germans. Someone close to the resistance." The word sent a chill down Marcus's spine. They were walking into a trap, and they didn't even know who had set it. The next several hours were a blur of desperate movement through the mountains. Lucia seemed to know every path, every hiding place, but Marcus could see the strain wearing on her. They were being hunted now, not just by the Germans, but by Enzo's men as well. When they finally reached the predetermined meeting point, a ruined chapel overlooking the Pontremoli Bridge, they found representatives from 3 different partisan groups waiting. The atmosphere was tense, with old grudges and political differences barely contained beneath the surface of their supposed cooperation. Marcus quickly explained the situation, but his words were met with skepticism. "How do we know this American isn't feeding us false information?" demanded Carlo, the leader of a group of former Italian soldiers. "Perhaps this is a German trick." "The bridge has been there for 500 years, added another partisan leader. "Why would they destroy it now?" But Lucia stood and addressed the group with quiet authority. "Because they know we need it. Because they know the Allies are coming." She looked around the circle of weathered faces. "My village was destroyed because someone informed the Germans that we were helping the resistance. My family died because someone they trusted betrayed them." Her words carried weight, but Marcus could see doubt in some of the faces. The partisan groups had suffered too many betrayals, lost too many good people to false intelligence. Trust was a luxury they could no longer afford. It was then that Enzo arrived with his men, surrounding the chapel with military precision. "So," he said, stepping into the circle, "the American has more stories to tell." "This isn't about politics," Marcus said, standing despite the weapons now pointed at him. "This is about keeping that bridge intact so Allied forces can cross." Enzo smiled coldly. "Or perhaps it's about ensuring the bridge is destroyed so the Allies cannot cross. Tell me, Lieutenant, which side are you really working for?" The accusation hung in the air like poison. Marcus saw doubt creeping into the faces around him, saw hands moving toward weapons. The situation was spiraling out of control. "There's one way to settle this," Lucia said suddenly. All eyes turned to her. "We watch the bridge tonight. If the Germans come to destroy it, we know the American is telling the truth. If they don't, he dies," Enzo finished. As darkness fell, the partisan groups took positions around the bridge. Marcus found himself essentially under guard, watched by men who still weren't sure whether he was an ally or an enemy. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd flown dozens of missions over Europe, protecting bombers and fighting German fighters, only to face potential execution at the hands of people who should have been his allies. Lucia stayed close to him, her rifle across her knees as they crouched behind a low stone wall. "If this goes wrong," she whispered, "can you swim?" Marcus glanced down at the river flowing beneath the ancient bridge. "Well enough. The current is strong here. It will carry you downstream, away from all this." She paused. "I'm sorry. I brought you into this." "No," Marcus said firmly. "You saved my life. Everything else is just complications." They waited in silence as the hours crawled by. The bridge remained peaceful, moonlight reflecting off the old stones. Marcus began to wonder if his information had been wrong, if the radio transmission had been a German deception designed to cause exactly this kind of chaos among the partisan groups. Then, just after midnight, they saw the lights. A column of German vehicles approached from the south, moving slowly and quietly. Marcus counted at least 2 trucks and what looked like an engineering vehicle. His heart began to race as he realized what he was seeing. "There," he whispered to Lucia. "They're coming." But as the vehicles drew closer, something felt wrong. The column stopped well short of the bridge, and soldiers began unloading equipment in the darkness. Through the night vision binoculars that one of the partisans had acquired, Marcus could see them setting up what looked like a mortar position. They're not going to blow the bridge, he realized with growing alarm. They're going to shell it from a distance, make it look like battle damage. The implications hit him like a physical blow. If the bridge appeared to have been damaged in fighting, the Allies would expect it to be unusable. They would alter their plans, perhaps fatally, but if the bridge was actually intact, "It's a trap," Lucia breathed. "They want the Allies to think the bridge is destroyed, so they won't use it. But it will still be there, heavily defended, when our forces try to find another crossing point." Around them, the other partisans were beginning to understand as well. But now they faced a terrible choice. If they attacked the German position, they would alert the enemy to their presence and likely ensure the bridge's destruction. If they did nothing, the deception would succeed. It was Enzo who proposed the solution, though it was hardly what Marcus would have called ideal. "The American's airplane," he said. "It crashed not far from here. If it can be made to fly—" Marcus stared at him. "You want me to steal a German plane? There's a small airfield about 10 kilometers north. The Germans use it for reconnaissance flights and medical evacuations. If you could reach the Allied forces, warn them about the deception." The plan was insane, desperate, and probably suicidal, but as Marcus looked at the faces around him, Lucia's especially, he realized it might be their only chance. "I'll need help getting to the airfield," he said finally. "I'll take you," Lucia said immediately. "No." Marcus shook his head. "This is a one-way mission. Even if I make it off the ground, the chances of reaching Allied lines, then you'll need someone on the ground to create a distraction." Her dark eyes met his. "I'm going with you." The next few hours were among the longest of Marcus's life. He and Lucia made their way through the darkness toward the German airfield, while behind them, the other partisan groups prepared to assault the mortar position when the time was right. The airfield was smaller than Marcus had hoped, just a grass strip with a handful of buildings and perhaps 6 aircraft. Most were Fieseler-Storch reconnaissance planes, slow and fragile. But there was one fighter, a Messerschmitt Bf 109, that had probably been forced down by mechanical problems. "Can you fly that?" Lucia whispered as they crouched in the tree line. Marcus studied the German fighter. It was similar enough to American aircraft that he thought he could manage it, but there would be no time for a familiarization flight. It would be takeoff or die trying. "Maybe," he said, "but first we need to deal with the guards." There were only 4 German soldiers visible, probably a skeleton crew left to guard the field while most of the unit was deployed elsewhere. But they were alert and well-positioned, and Marcus had no illusions about what would happen if they were discovered. It was Lucia who solved the problem. While Marcus worked his way around to the fighter, she created a distraction on the opposite side of the field. The sound of breaking glass and a small explosion, probably a grenade she'd been carrying, drew the guards away from the aircraft. Marcus sprinted across the open ground, his heart hammering in his chest. The cockpit of the Bf 109 was cramped and unfamiliar, with German instruments and controls that he had to decipher by touch in the darkness. But aviation was aviation, and after a few crucial seconds, he found what he needed. The engine coughed to life with a roar that seemed deafeningly loud in the night air. Behind him, he could hear shouts and gunfire as the Germans realized what was happening. A bullet starred the canopy just inches from his head. The Messerschmitt lurched forward, gathering speed on the rough grass strip. Marcus had never taken off in complete darkness before, with no runway lights and hostile fire erupting around him. The aircraft bumped and swayed as it picked up speed, and for a terrifying moment he thought it might not have enough power to get airborne. Then the wheels left the ground, and he was climbing into the night sky over occupied Italy. Below him, muzzle flashes lit up the airfield as the German guards fired uselessly at his rapidly climbing aircraft. But his thoughts were on Lucia, somewhere in the darkness below, probably fighting for her life against soldiers who now knew exactly where she was. The flight to Allied lines took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Marcus flew low and fast, following roads and rivers that he hoped would lead him to safety. When he finally saw the distinctive star markings on Allied vehicles below, he nearly wept with relief. The landing was controlled chaos. The fighter base he chose was fortunately accustomed to damaged aircraft making emergency approaches, but a German fighter flown by an American pilot was unusual even by wartime standards. By the time Marcus had shut down the engine and climbed from the cockpit, he was surrounded by men with weapons drawn. "Lieutenant Marcus Williams, 332nd Fighter Group," he said, raising his hands. "I have critical intelligence about German operations near Pontremoli." The debriefing took precious hours. Marcus explained about the bridge, the German deception, and the partisan groups preparing to act. But even as Allied commanders scrambled to adjust their plans, his thoughts kept returning to Lucia. Had she escaped the airfield? Was she alive? The answer came sooner than he expected. As dawn broke over the Italian countryside, radio reports began coming in from the Pontremoli area. The partisan groups had successfully attacked the German mortar position, but at a heavy cost. Several fighters had been killed, including 2 group leaders. But the bridge still stood. More importantly, Allied intelligence confirmed that the German deception had been just as Marcus described. The enemy had indeed planned to make the bridge appear damaged while keeping it intact as a trap. Thanks to the advance warning, Allied forces were able to secure the crossing point and continue their offensive as planned. It wasn't until 3 days later that Marcus learned Lucia's fate. A message came through partisan radio networks, brief and coded, but unmistakably from her. She had survived the airfield assault and made her way back to the mountains. The message contained just a few words, but they made Marcus smile for the first time in days. "The sky is now our land." Marcus spent the rest of the war flying missions over Europe, eventually returning to the United States as part of the great demobilization that followed Germany's surrender. He went home to Alabama, used the GI Bill to finish college, and eventually became a teacher, something that would have been nearly impossible for a black man in his hometown before the war. But he never forgot Italy or the woman who had saved his life in more ways than one. Years passed. The world changed. The civil rights movement transformed America, slowly and often painfully. Marcus married, had children, and watched them grow up in a world where a black pilot wasn't quite as unusual as it had been during the war. It was in 1965, 21 years after he'd crashed in a Tuscan vineyard, that the first package arrived. The return address was from Italy, from a place called Villa Sangiovese. Inside, Marcus found a bottle of wine with a hand-drawn label. The picture showed a red-tailed fighter plane flying over rolling hills covered with grapevines. At the bottom, in careful English, were the words, "The sky is now our land." The bottles came every year after that, each one with a different hand-drawn label, but the same message. Sometimes the pictures showed the bridge at Pontremoli still standing. Sometimes they depicted the old monastery where they had sheltered, or the chapel where the partisan groups had met. Always there was the inscription. Marcus never wrote back. He didn't know what he would say, how he could possibly express what those months in Italy had meant to him. Lucia had given him more than his life. She had shown him what it meant to fight for something larger than yourself, to find hope in the darkest of circumstances. In 1975, on the 30th anniversary of the war's end, the package contained something different along with the usual bottle. It was a photograph, black and white but clear enough to see every detail. It showed a vineyard in full bloom, with neat rows of vines stretching up a hillside toward a restored stone farmhouse. In the foreground, a woman with graying hair stood beside a young man in work clothes. Both were smiling. On the back of the photograph, in the same careful handwriting he remembered from all those years ago, was a message. Giuseppe would have been 35 this year. This is his son, Marco. He wants to be a pilot when he grows up. Perhaps someday he will visit the country where the red-tailed fighters came from. Perhaps you could tell him stories about the war and about hope and about the sky that became our land. With gratitude always, Lucia. Marcus sat in his study for a long time that evening, holding the photograph and thinking about the strange paths life takes. Outside, his own grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter carrying through the windows. The world had changed in ways he could never have imagined during those dark days in occupied Italy, but some things remained constant. The need to fight for what was right, the power of hope to sustain people through their darkest hours, the belief that tomorrow could be better than today, if enough people were willing to work for it. He picked up a pen and began to write his first letter to Italy in 30 years. There were stories to tell after all. Stories about the sky and the land and the people who had learned that sometimes the two weren't so different after all. The bottle of wine sat unopened on his desk, the hand-drawn label catching the lamplight. A red-tailed fighter soared over vineyards that had been planted in the ruins of war, tended by hands that had once held weapons but now coaxed life from the soil. Outside, night settled over Alabama, and somewhere across the ocean, dawn was breaking over the hills of Tuscany. The sky was vast enough for all of them, pilots and partisans, dreamers and fighters, all those who had learned that the greatest victories were not won in battle, but in the quiet moments afterward, when people chose to build rather than destroy, to hope rather than despair. The sky indeed had become their land.